Recently on a coach call, we were talking about a client who is working on improving their storytelling and resources we could offer them to support their growth as a storyteller. And as a team at Spoken with Authority, we realized that we had a couple resources that we went to, but we didn't feel like any of the resources were amazing for storytelling, and decided that we would have a book club so we could dive into some more books on storytelling, so we could share them to our clients, but also to anyone in the Spoken with Authority community who is interested in becoming a storyteller, because being a storyteller is an important part of being a communicator. One of the theorists we studied in graduate school is Walter Fisher, who argues that humans are homo narrans, that the thing that makes us different from other animals is that we understand the world through stories. So they are really central to our experience as humans, as communicators, and to connect and influence others. So I'm here with some of my coaches so that we can all talk about the books that we read for our book club and share some of the highlights, so that if you want to read any that stand out, we welcome you to do that. But maybe just learning from the highlights will be a great way to glean some new storytelling advice. So Michelle, would you be willing to tell us about the book that you read and some of the highlights?
Absolutely. This book is an absolute gem. It's written by two Silicon Valley bred sisters, Janine Kurnoff and Lee Lazarus. Everyday business storytelling reminds us, and these are my big takeaways, to not bury the lead, that captions should be in a conversational tone and very concise. Sometimes we can plague our slides with very vague language, but when we let people know what's coming up, it gives them the option to perk up and tune in. And not just our captions, but also the details, to make sure that the details, especially if it's data, that it's readily available. Because as you talked about how we make sense of the world through storytelling, we also relate new information to previous knowledge. So when we can take what we're hearing and connect it to what we already know, we're motivated to action. So when we make information readily available to our audience's mind's eye, we can create that relevance that tells us what change we need to make, or what we need to keep doing, or what we need to stop doing, right? And my other big takeaway was this. I don't know how well you can see this. Believe it or not, the information on those 2 pages were absolutely the same. So they also have before and after shots of slides. And I'm telling you, anyone and everyone can find some sort of faux pas they're making in this book and see how little changes can make a big difference. So this is why Everyday Storytelling by Kurnoff and Lazarus is my vote.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Michelle. Sounds like an incredible book. And is there a specific type of person who you think this would be good for? The one thing that I thought of in listening to you was someone who is working with visuals for presentations. So someone who uses slides to supplement. Are there other folks who you think this would be great for?
Yeah, although I focused on the slides, I think slides is something that if you're not a graphic artist, you just do the best you can. So I think that it gives you a really good format and some really specific guidance of positioning your information visually, but also for content creation as well, because they go over all the what we call narrative elements of who, what, when, and how to position that information to capture your audience early on. So not just for a visual presentation, but also for organizing and structuring your content.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. Lynn, tell us about your book and the highlights of it.
Well, my book is How to Tell a Story, and it is put together by the producers of the radio podcast from the Moth. It starts with the very basics of telling stories, and I think that it plays off well what Michelle was just talking about, but going back to the whole idea that we as human beings understand the world and we make sense of the world by making stories about what we know. And even if what someone wants to share with a greater audience is data rich with certain details about it, you still want to create the overall vessel of from where they're going to consume and take in this information. One of the things that this book does well is to tease out for everyone that you do have stories to tell, because I think a lot of people believe they don't. And because of that narrow belief of what storytelling is, they only want to do a recitation of certain information and not grab people in. But with these different vignettes and ideas from the Moth, it shows people how they can look at, drill down into the specifics of situations they've been in and find the kernel of the overall truth. Because basically, telling stories is a way to connect with your audience. And the connection is what's going to make the sharing of the information more memorable. It also makes an important distinction between anecdote and story. Anecdote can be one illustrative example of something that happened that you can take out of everyday life or your work environment, and it has its place, absolutely. Story has a narrative arc, and that's important for me, and for my previous career as a journalist, is to take your audience somewhere and then, as we've said many times in these conversations, stick the landing. Remember where you're going with it, and it's for it to be transformative. Something happened. So in a story, there's some change. There's some change of awareness or something. And people can also use that with what happens in their workplace or new technique that they want to share. Like, remember when the phones were so wonky and you kept on dropping the call? Now with 5G, we're in a different place. And this is how this has been made better for us. Story. I've really enjoyed this book, and the way that they have it put together, saying that everyone has a story, how to develop your story, how to tell your story, and then looking back at how one person sharing a story can have so much impact on other people. And I think that that's another thing that sometimes our speakers can forget, that they are having additional impact that goes out beyond the room. And last thing about this book is that it has little vignettes from so many Moth storytellers, so it makes it an enjoyable read.
Lynn, thanks so much for that overview. And it sounds like this could be a great book for someone who might be a little bit reluctant to tell stories because they're in more of a technical profession or just have never tapped into that part of their communication style. Are there other types of people who you think this would be a good fit for?
I think that there's broad application to this book, because the other part about being aware of the stories that we use and tell, it's also an introspective process, and it can tell you more about yourself, which can be really valuable.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Jean, what about you? What do you read, and what do you think about it?
I read Stories That Stick by Kindra Hall. Sorry, there we go. Can you see that? And I have another positive review. I was fully anticipating that it would be trite or unhelpful or not tell me anything new. And I don't know that there's a lot really new in this book. I had my own version of what goes into a story, but I found it to be really a quick, easy read, and a lot of helpful practical advice. And the core tenet here is about how stories allow us to create attention, they allow us to influence and to transform people and relationships. And Kindra Hall really sticks with those themes throughout. She gives us what are the core elements of a story. And again, they're not really different, but I like the way she puts them. She says you have to have some kind of identifiable character or characters. So someone or something, doesn't have to be human, that people can relate to. You have to have authentic emotion. It has to stir or reveal some kind of emotion. You have to have a moment of realization, or that moment of transformation that Lynn was referring to. And this was an important one, specific details. And this is where you have to be really careful about not getting in the weeds, but including something like the person's age, or the make of car they were driving, or what the sky looked like that day. Some little detail that people can relate to. And then she puts it all in a really neat structure. Those elements go into a structure. And I think we all know the basic structure of a story, but instead of, the hero's journey and 11 elements or something, she says there's normal, then there's the explosion, that is, there's that something that happens, and then there's the new normal, the outcome. And finally, she does spend the last chapter telling you how to find your own stories. But really, throughout the book, there are a lot of examples, and those, I think, help you to generate your own versions of those stories as well.
Amazing. That sounds like a really great book to help people break down what makes a good story, because there are people who want to tell stories, but they're not really effective stories. And knowing the elements, I think, can help some of those speakers. And in fact, the book that I read does not go into that in that same level of detail. So I think my book would be a good corollary to your book, maybe as like the second step. Yours seems like it's pretty foundational, which I think is great. Did you have any other thoughts on types of people who might benefit from that?
I think based on the examples that she uses, probably people in sales, marketing, advertising, it would be very good for, but also for leaders who are trying to inspire members of their organizations.
Amazing. That's great. So my book is Whoever Tells the Best Story Wins by Annette Simmons. And I wanted to first start with her definition of story, because I think that's helpful. This is why I define story as a reimagined experience narrated with enough detail and feeling to cause your listeners' imaginations to experience it as real. So that gets to some of the elements you were talking about, Jean, in terms of detail and emotion. The other thing that I wanted to mention with regard to this book is that it provides different types of stories that a speaker or a leader can categorize and think about telling so that they can have a repertoire. And I think that's really helpful, and doesn't sound like yours goes too much into that, Jean. So I think, again, this would be a nice intermediate or advanced step. Yeah. Oh, it does.
She has 4 types of stories.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
So there's a little categorization.
Yeah. So this one is really focused on the types of stories rather than the storytelling process. So just so you could see them here. Who am I stories? Why am I here stories? Teaching stories, vision stories, value and action stories. I know what you are thinking stories. So those are the 6 types. And I was really most interested in, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the who am I stories, because I do think that they are really important for leaders and communicators to have those in the repertoire first. So this is what she says here in chapter 5 on Who Am I Stories. The most important story you will ever tell is who am I? Your life is the long version of this story. Everything you have been, have done, haven't done, have dreamed of, will do, will be, and won't be is your story. Your ability to influence people is directly related to what others know or believe who you are. This is also called intimacy, and you can help establish intimacy with who am I stories. That is telling others something about yourself so they can trust you. People can't trust someone they don't know. If you are so professional and so private that no one really knows you, you are making it twice as hard for others to trust you. A New York Times CBS survey asked of people in general, how many do you think are trustworthy? On average, people thought about 30% of people in general would be trustworthy. Then the survey asked of the people you know, how many do you think are trustworthy? The answer, 70%. Not only is it statistically impossible for these beliefs to be accurate, but the findings further demonstrate the irrational, nonlinear dynamics of trust. If I feel I know you personally, I attribute twice as much trustworthiness to you. If you are a stranger, I give you a 30% chance of being trustworthy. Familiarity builds a bridge between you and your listener so your information can get to them. Often, those we need to influence don't know us very well, so they can't trust us. A good Who Am I story is like increasing the bandwidth between you and your listeners, thus increasing the amount of information your listeners are ready to receive. And I wanted to share this to all of our technical experts, our subject matter experts who say to us, no one in my industry tells stories. No one in my organization tells stories. I have to just stick to the data. I have to stick to the facts. People will trust you more in the information you're bringing to them if you can open up and share about yourself, reveal about yourself, have that intimacy. So it is really important and appropriate to tell stories, even in the most serious of circumstances, with the most serious of scientists or health professionals or attorneys, or you name the specialty. It is absolutely appropriate to weave in stories among the facts and data that you are trying to convey to your listeners. So I think it's a great book, and maybe a little of a intermediate or advanced book for folks, and some others might be good for a starting point on actually putting together the stories and getting better at crafting them, because this one does not have it has some examples and details, but it sounds like especially you, Lynn, and Jean had great stories with more rich examples than this one might have had. So a really great overview of lots of different books on storytelling. So hopefully our community members will learn some from our summaries and might be even inspired to pick up one of these books and learn a little bit more. So thanks for doing the initial reading and review and sharing. It was really great to chat with you all today.